Well, I need to get to work on Deck Doctors, but I have no idea what to do for the final episode. I could sure use some divine intervention right now, but that just doesn't happen to normal people. What the? Alright. I forgot I'm not normal people.
What's up, my man? Let's go turn up some. Oh, what the hell? Oh, come on. Zach, will you not get to do? I'm gonna rip off his little.
Steve, what the hell are you doing here? Shouldn't you be off making Zach's life a living hell about now?
What was that you were saying?
You alright in there, man? You almost look like you're trying to lay an egg in there.
I'm clucking mail! Oh, it's this stupid thing Zach decided to put me in. Anytime I want to space-time somebody, I think Zach has to come along and stick me in this.
Easy there, Foster Farms. Remember your blood pressure. Now, could you please cluck off? I'm trying to...
Think of something for your Deck Doctors finale of your completely obvious ripoff of
Well, I was planning on sitting here in agony for a few more hours, but why not? Go ahead and hit me with your best shot, McNugget.
Okay, we're gonna start off with... Wait. What did you just call me?
Which one, the Foster Farms comment or the Chicken McNugget one? Yep, this is my life now.
I can't do this, man. I can't do it. Okay. I'm calm. Yeah, I'm calm. Okay. Can't do this anymore. All right, fine. Let's get this stupid crap of yours over with. How about Kawaki, Kawaki Mairu for the finale? What about that, huh?
Nah, Emancipator and Rockstun are a thing.
What about penguins? You can't deny they have a certain pizzazz about them.
Nah, Glacial Beast build with Great Emperor.
Fine, alright. Karakuri?
Boring.
Clucking Mechlords?
Are you my comment section?
Oh yeah, comment section. Like you even have one!
You want to check the plank in your own eye first there, Mr. 15 subscribers?
For cluck's sake! Look, since I prefer not to go Judges 15-16 all over your little I suggest you shut up and pay attention. I haven't done this in a couple of years.
Wait, what are you?
Phew, made out that one, all right?
Wow, that actually worked. Now I know what I must do. Thanks, Steve. You're not actually as useless as I thought you were.
Yeah, I still don't care. See, dude, good luck with the finale. And now, off to real chicken business.
Well, it's glad to know that I'm finally starting to suffer from whatever auditory hallucination Zach has. Welcome, everybody, to the final episode of... The Deck Doctors. I'm gonna need a whole lot more of this to get through this one. You people should be used to me not knowing how to start a video by now, but let's set that aside for the moment to look at the monumental task I've given myself for the finale. As you are probably aware, Archfiends are among the oldest archetypes in the game, beaten only by Gravekeepers and Amazoness and tied with Guardians in terms of age, the latter of which being part of the reason why I chose this archetype to close off the series to begin with. Some of these cards are so old, in fact, that they harken back to the early days before archetypes were written with quotation marks like we were savages or something. However, even more notable than their age is their notoriously schizophrenic design philosophy, which seemed to comprise mostly of random pack filler trash to the point which it makes Red Eyes and Ninjas look like competently designed archetypes. It's so bad that trying to define a singular playstyle that encompasses all of them is virtually impossible, as they are so far all over the place that there is always going to be at least a few outliners no matter how loosely defined the parameters are. Most of this is due to their incredibly generic name, which allows for several accidental members that fall into the archetype without being designed for it. I mean, hell, it even has Fiend in the name. It doesn't get any more generic than that. It gets worse in the Japanese, however, as the original name for the archetype is known as... Oh, you've got to be fucking kidding me. Demon. It's known as Daemon in Japanese. What's next? An archetype of warriors named after a generic word used to describe any kind of fighter? Oh. Anyway, this intro is long enough already, and we have a long road ahead of us, so let's just get started already. Get yourself comfy because it's gonna be a long ride. For the most part, Archfiends can be divided into 4 groups, but before we get into those, let's quickly run through the ones that don't fall into either of these categories. Note that some of these English names don't have Archfiend in the title since KOA are a bunch of idiots, but they thankfully all have a name clause that includes them in the archetype nonetheless. So with that in mind, let's get started with the mass review. Shadow Tamer, a crappy flip effect monster that's only really useful for waifu bait. Cyber Archfiend, one of those crappy early cards supposed to generate advantage in a losing situation that subsequently makes it almost useless. Archfiend Interceptor, one of the worst attack floodgates I've ever seen in my life. Trance Archfiend, decent in Duel Links, borderline useless anywhere else. Lancer Archfiend, piercing damage, and that's about it. Skilled Red Magician, a non-archetypal support card that uses spell counters for some ungodly reason. Mad Archfiend, a spear dragon with 100 less attack and a heroin addiction. Infernity Archfiend, pretty good as an Infernity card, not so much as an Archfiend card. Lesser Fiend, one level too high to be considered worth it even back when it first came out. Mist Archfiend, a bad cyber dragon that eats up the normal summon. Archfiend of Gilfer, a crappy battle floater that couldn't be more outdated if it tried. Archfiend Mirror, crappy normal monster. Beast of Talwar, crappy normal monster. Archfiend Soldier, okay, that's actually pretty good for a vanilla. Also, the Earth Charmers familiars, see the Charmer video for my thoughts on those. Red Eyes Archfiend of Lightning and the 2 Black Skull Dragons, see the Red Eyes video for my thoughts on those. Fiend Skull Dragon, a fusion of Lesser Fiend that somehow manages to be even worse. Archfiend Zombie Skull, a zombie synchro that pushes way too specific to be worth the effort. Chaos King Archfiend, works better as an Ojama card even though they can barely summon the thing. Scrap Archfiend, a generic level 7 synchro with no effect. Thought Ruler Archfiend, an early psychic monster with all the poor design choices that come with the territory. Overmind Archfiend, an upgraded version that actually becomes useful despite the abysmal summoning condition. Number C102 Archfiend Seraph, waste of a perfectly good rum card when there are so many better targets. Vector Scare Archfiend, a better/worse Goyo Guardian hard-locked into Cybers monsters. Link Mail Archfiend, generic boss monster that might have seen play if not for the fact that it came out in the same set as Appaloosa. A Deal with Dark Ruler, a crappy comeback card that lets you replace one boss monster with a decidedly worse one. Gladiator Beast Battle Archfiend Shield, a kind of protection that Glad Beasts really didn't need. Axe of Despair, big numbers and that's about it. And Nightmare Archfiends, a worse Ojama trio that requires a tribute for some reason, which makes it a -5 in case you weren't keeping track. Whew! 33 cards out of the way, and we've still yet to get into the review proper. But with that taken care of, we can finally break the remaining 50 plus down into a much more manageable state. The first of the 4 sub-series of Archfiends is also the first attempt at archetypal synergy in the game, that being chess archfiends. They were used by this character in a shitty filler episode of GX in a grand total of 1 duel, so nobody cared much when he disappeared into the depths of the Shadow Realm. They're all designed with a chessboard motif in that most of their monsters are based on a particular chess piece, and that's about it. As mentioned earlier, this is Konami's first attempt at effect theming and archetypal synergy, so thankfully this means that this part of the review should be comparatively quick. To set up this theme, we start off with our first monster, Vilepon Archfiend. It's a level 2 Earth Fiend with 1200 attack and 200 defense and the following effect. The controller of this card pays 500 life points during each of his or her standby phases. This is not optional. When this card is targeted by the effect of a card controlled by your opponent, when resolving the effect, roll a 6-sided die. If the result is 3, negate the effect and destroy the opponent's card. As long as this card remains face up on the field, your opponent cannot attack any Archfiend monster on your side of the field except Vilepon Archfiend. Beefy stats for a level 2 aside, there's not much to recommend with this card. The life point cost and the dice roll negation are shared among all chess Archfiends and serves as the aforementioned archetypal synergy, as well as the reason why nobody played them when they first came out, let alone now. The exact amount of life points paid and numbers needed to roll vary from monster to monster, but even in the best of circumstances, it's not worth the effort. In this case, 500 is both the most common cost and also the lowest, so it at least gets a pass on that front. However, in regards to the RNG targeting negation, it only gets 1 number to work with, and it's not a number that can be easily cheesed out either, meaning that it's only a full odds 1 in 6 chance in the best of circumstances. If you do manage to pull it off, it's actually pretty good protection, especially considering that it doesn't start a chain, but since it's never going to go off, this can't be taken as a positive for this card. As for its individual effect, all it does is redirect your opponent's attacks to your weakest monster, which is not going to help you in the slightest. It doesn't even allow you to set up an MC lock by controlling 2 of them, because the wording just lets the opponent choose which of the little skelly boys they want to run over first. I guess it's thematic that the pawn is the weakest member of the archetype, but theming isn't enough to make me want to run this anyway. The next monster is Dark Bishop Archfiend, who is, surprisingly enough, not a dark monster. It's a level 3 water with 300 attack and 1400 defense. His cost is 500, his lucky numbers are 1, 3, and 6, and his unique effect, if you can even call it that, is that he extends his RNG protection to all Archfiends you control. I would even go as far as to call this good if it weren't for the fact that his stats are by far the worst of the lot, and that's saying a lot for an early Duel Monsters era card. His protection has the most numbers out of all of them, including the critical 1 and 6, and he extends those numbers to each of your other monsters, who can in turn stack on top of their own numbers as well. This only applies to 2 of them at the moment, but it's something at least. However, the fact that this card can so easily be run over by most monsters run in Chain Beat means that it'll rarely get the chance to protect any of his allies this way. Even using the attack boosting effects in the archetype, he's rarely going to get an attack higher than his already poor defense, and there's also the fact that said boosts are only temporary and will only last through your turn, to the point where they won't be able to be useful in the slightest. I really wish I could recommend this one just on the basis of his numbers alone, but as it stands, it's a questionable side deck choice at best. Their next monster is Deathrook Archfiend, a level 3 light for some reason, with 1100 attack and 1800 defense, has a cost of 500, his lucky number is 3, and when a Terror King Archfiend you control is destroyed, you can send this card from the hand to the graveyard to target and revive that monster. To be clear, this is in fact a quick effect, despite the card not specifying as such, so it does actually work as intended. As a hand trap, it is pretty good by early game standards, since it allows you to maintain board advantage in case you missed the effect negation window, but the fact that it's limited to a single monster, which is difficult to bring to the field to begin with, means that it's way too specific to be worth the effort. It has decent stats for a level 3, especially one from 2003, but since this card isn't supposed to be played on the field, it doesn't mean jack shit for this archetype. If this card's stats were on the previous monster, they might have been able to be played with a lot easier, but because they're not, this deck is a lot more trouble than it's worth. If you're actually building a chess Archfiend deck for whatever reason, then 1 or 2 should be fine on the grounds that the one monster this effect works on is sort of important for them. But if you're building literally any other Archfiend build, don't even think about this one. The next monster is Infernal Queen Archfiend, a level 4 fire with 900 attack and 1500 defense, has a standby cost of 500, her lucky numbers are 2 and 5, and during each standby phase you can increase the attack of one Archfiend monster by 1000 until the end phase. For a 1000 boost to your bigger beat sticks, this is fairly decent. Some of the other Archfiends already have some beefy attack stats, so boosting them by another grand will allow them to beat over just about anything. However, much like Dark Bishop, the main problem with this card is her own crappy stats. Even in defense position, a 1500 wall isn't going to stand up against any sort of attacks coming your way, even at the time of this card's release. Sure, the effect works on the opponent's turn as well, and she can certainly give herself the attack boost, but at that point you might as well be playing Archfiend Soldier if you want a 1900 level 4 beater. Still, as far as chess Archfiends go, it could be a lot worse, so again run 2 or 3 in a dedicated build. The next monster is Terror King Archfiend, a level 4 dark with 2000 attack and 1500 defense, has a cost of 800, his lucky numbers are 2 and 5, cannot be normal or flip summoned unless you control another Archfiend, and he negates the effects of monsters he kills by battle. This is the card that chess Archfiends entirely revolve around, and for the life of me I cannot understand why. Sure, a 2k beater on a level 4 with no restrictions, or at least not that much more restrictions than the rest of its archetype, was a pretty good thing to have back in the day, but not only is this extremely outdated nowadays, but the additional restrictions of requiring another Archfiend in order to be normal summoned limits what it can do as a first turn play, which is the whole point of having low-level beaters anyway. There are no restrictions on special summoning, but aside from some very specific recovery cards, there's also no options for special summoning this either. The effect negation of monsters killed by battle with this is also severely outdated as well, since while it can prevent some obnoxious floaters from going off, the fact that it only applies through battle also limits its utility severely. Like I said, chess Archfiends rely on this card very heavily through cards like Deathrook, so again, if you're building a chess Archfiend deck for some reason, you'll need to max out on this one, not because you want to, but because you have to. The next monster is Shadow Knight Archfiend, a level 4 wind with 2000 attack and 1600 defense, has a cost of 900, his lucky number is 3, and any battle damage it inflicts is halved. If there were any of the early Archfiends you would want to run in a modern build, this would probably be it. It has the second worst cost and in a 3-way tie for second worst dice roll protection, but as a far less restrictive Terror King, it's actually capable of performing what the latter is meant to be doing. Battle damage isn't as relevant as it used to be, so having it is hardly a cost you have to worry about nowadays, especially if you take into account modern Archfiends as well. That being said, all it does is serve as a first turn beater, which is hardly a relevant play in modern decks. Even in chess Archfiends, they would much rather run Terror King anyway due to cards that directly support him over generic Archfiends. Overall, it's pretty decent at what it does, but the problem is that what it does is severely outdated. Run by preference. Setting aside the chess theme for a moment, the next monster in the lineup is Archfiend General. It's a level 4 dark with 2100 attack and 800 defense, and it has a completely different effect from the rest. You can discard this card to search out Pandemonium, but if this card is on the field and Pandemonium is not, destroy this card. Having almost nothing to do with the rest of the archetype, I almost missed this one if not for the fact that it directly searches out their field spell. Said field spell is the crutch that allows this deck to function, which is rather sad considering how lackluster it is. But since they need it regardless, they need as much searching options as they can get in order to get it on the field faster. Be sure to run 3 of these. Next up, we have another non-chess related chess Archfiend in the form of Skull Archfiend of Lightning. It's a level 6 dark with 2500 attack and 1200 defense, has a cost of 500, his lucky numbers are 1, 3, and 6, and he has no additional effect.
Okay, big number.
Jokes aside, this is actually fairly decent. It ties with Dark Bishop in terms of having the best cost to protection ratio, and it has a beefy attack stat for a level 6, putting it in the same category as Shadow Knight for non-restrictive beaters in this archetype. Tribute fodder in this archetype can be tricky to come by, but it's still the closest thing chess Archfiends have to a boss monster, and they can turbo him out if need be, so 1 or 2 of these should be sufficient. The last 2 monsters are retrains of ones that we've covered so far, so we're nearing the end of this lineup already. The last main deck monster is Imprisoned Queen Archfiend, a massive level 8 dark with 2600 attack and 1700 defense. She has a massive cost of 1000, no lucky numbers whatsoever, and during your standby phase you can target a level 4 or lower fiend monster on the field and give it 1000 attack until the end phase. Pandemonium must be on the field and this card in the graveyard in order to activate and resolve this effect. This serves as a simultaneously better and worse version of her original form. It has the worst maintenance cost out of all of them and no protection whatsoever, but that might be because it's not meant to be on the field to begin with. The attack boost works on any fiend monster, but only as long as it's level 4 or lower, and it only triggers on your standby phase as opposed to any standby phase, meaning that the monster you want to boost will need to survive the opponent's turn as well. However, it is significantly harder for the opponent to disrupt than Infernal Queen, since it's harder to remove cards from the graveyard than it is the field. That being said, the effect counts both sides of the field as well, and is not optional, so it is possible for the opponent to take advantage of the effect themselves in certain matchups, by either killing or stealing your low-level fiend so that they're the only ones who control the target for this card. Furthermore, this effect also requires the player to run their mediocre field spell in order to function, which is its own can of worm zeros to deal with. But it also gives the opponent another out to this card by simply removing said field spell instead. Still, the effect is handy enough if you're able to pull it off, and it's not a once per turn, so it can stack on top of multiple copies of itself. So if you have a consistent way to mill them out to the graveyard, it can serve as a decent win condition, so be sure to run 3 of them. The last monster is a recent addition to the archetype, Master King Archfiend. It's a Link 2 with 2000 attack and perfect arrows, requires 2 fiends as material, and has a maintenance cost of 500, albeit an optional one this time. Once per chain, if you pay life points, you can mill a fiend to the graveyard with attack or defense equal to the amount you paid. And also once per chain, if a fiend is sent to your graveyard except during the damage step, you can roll a 6-sided die and apply the appropriate effect to one of those monsters. If the result is a 1, you add it to your hand. If it's a 6, you special summon it. And if it's literally anything else, spin it back to your deck. This really should be a lot better than it actually is. The fact that each of his effects triggers the next, and that none of them are a once per turn, means that you could theoretically gain a ton of free advantage, assuming the die rolls in your favor. However, if you add that 6 into the mix, you're pretty much guaranteed to be able to hit the numbers required to gain that advantage. This is helped by the fact that the die roll effect triggers regardless of how the fiends are sent to the graveyard, whether it's by card effect or as using them as material. Hell, even this card's own Link summon will proc this effect, so you have the ability to recycle one of the materials used to bring it out. However, if you want to mill with his own effect, you're going to be extremely limited in what you can do. More often than not, the number of life points you're going to be paying is 500, and as of right now, the only Archfiend with those stats is Trance Archfiend, which, as I already said, is borderline useless outside of Duel Links. Even if you look at the other chess Archfiends, you won't get any decent targets until you hit a cost of 1000, which will allow you to dump a certain staple searcher in the archetype, along with some decent BAs if you happen to be looking for outside support. However, this only works assuming you're controlling Imprisoned Queen, which, as we've discussed, is not what you're supposed to be doing with that card. It does count any life point cost, so if you have another way of paying exactly 1000 life points, this would be a fantastic card. But since the best options for this are either forbidden or limited, you won't be able to do so nearly as consistently as you should be. Still, a way to constantly generate advantage is a handy thing for any deck to have, and it's generic enough to not be landlocked into Chess Archfiends specifically, so feel free to run it at 2 or 3 regardless. Their first spell card is Checkmate, a normal spell that lets you tribute an Archfiend you control to let a Terror Archfiend you control attack directly this turn. This is a win more card if ever I saw one. While it is possible to OTK with this card if you happen to have some very specific setup, the fact that it requires a tribute makes an inherent -2, so you either need to go for the kill or you'll just end up losing in the next turn. Furthermore, it only works on Terror King, which is already a bit tricky to get out on the first turn, so you'll need to devote additional resources to set this up to begin with. Still, in a Chess Archfiend deck, you're not exactly pressed for deck space, so feel free to run a copy or two if it'll make you feel special. Archfiend's Oath is their next card, and it's a continuous spell that lets you once per turn pay 500 life points, then declare one card name, excavate the top card of your deck, and if it's the declared card, add it to your hand, but otherwise send it to the graveyard. A free mill with the potential of letting you go +1 instead sounds pretty damn good, all things considered. However, for the deck that it was intended for, you won't get too much out of it. Precious few Archfiends have graveyard effects, and fewer still have effects dealing with the hand, so there's not a whole lot that you'd want to add or mill with this effect. Really, the best thing about this card is that it lets you pay life points, but like I said with Master King, 500 isn't a number that Archfiends can benefit from very easily at the moment. It will trigger Master King's die roll effect if you happen to mill a fiend monster, but still, that's not exactly something that you can reliably use to your advantage. Overall, I would say that this is the first of the pot Gs in this archetype, and would most certainly pass over this one for the deck. The next card is Falling Down, an equipped spell that equips itself to an opponent's monster and lets you take control of it, but it destroys itself if you don't control an Archfiend monster, and during your opponent's standby phase, you take 800 damage. The fact that the maintenance cost for this card counts as damage is really annoying, since it not only avoids the effect that deal with life point costs, but it can also cause you to lose the game if your life points get too low, which they almost surely will be if you're playing this deck. However, if you use the opponent's monster as material immediately, this basically becomes a non-issue, since this card will almost never survive to the opponent's standby phase to begin with. The worst thing I can say about it is that it's basically landlocked into Archfiend, so other decks that could make better use of this card can't run it. Regardless, run 3. Next, we finally get to their much talked about field spell, Pandemonium. Neither player has to pay life points during the standby phase for Archfiend monsters. Each time a player's Archfiend monsters is destroyed by a card effect, that player can search an Archfiend monster with a lower level than the destroyed monster. Admittedly, this hasn't aged nearly as badly as other archetypal field spells from the early days, but that's still not saying much. The training wheels effect of turning off the maintenance costs of your monsters is to be expected for an archetype as old as this one. It does get in the way of Master King's pay to mill effect, but fortunately you can choose to pay the maintenance cost anyway if you so desire. The destruction floating effect was probably meant as another form of insurance in case the Archfiend's randomizer protection fails them. Considering later support, it has aged surprisingly well, since you can easily trigger the effect yourself in order to gain advantage. Still, it only works on destruction, and only effect destruction at that, so any other form of removal will easily work around this card. I also like how the effect works on both sides of the field, implying that you would ever be in an Archfiend mirror match back in the day. As far as old field spells in this game goes, it's not too bad, but there's still a better one coming up, so it's not nearly the best they have to offer either. That being said, running 2 or 3 of these in just about any Archfiend deck is still perfectly acceptable. Archfiend's Roar is their first trap card, a normal trap to be exact, that lets you pay 500 life points to target and special summon an Archfiend in your graveyard. It cannot be tributed, and it is destroyed during the end phase. Another card that has aged better with new support. The tribute prevention is no longer an issue, since the deck barely needs tribute fodder anyway, and even destroying it during the end phase can also work in tandem with certain other Archfiends, though it still requires some specific setup in either your hand or graveyard in order to effectively use. It's also a trap card, so it's naturally slower than one would like for an effect like this, but it's still versatile enough to warrant running 1 or 2 on its own. The last card in this set is Battle Scarred, a continuous trap that targets an Archfiend you control and forces the opponent to pay the same maintenance cost that you do for that monster. If this card leaves the field, destroy the targeted monster, and if the targeted monster leaves the field, destroy this card. As opposed to the last two, this one couldn't be more outdated if it tried. Not only does this force you to put a leash on one of your Archfiends, but all you get for it is forcing your opponent to pay a cost during each of your standby phases that will rarely exceed 800, and only if you also pay said cost yourself. It can't even kill your opponent since a player can never pay a life point cost greater than or equal to their current life points. It also forces you to play the chess Archfiends, obviously, since it only works on Archfiends that have a life point cost to their effect, as you can surely tell. Also, remember that Pandemonium affects both players, so if you have it on the field, which you probably will when playing the deck, your opponent can simply choose not to pay the cost even if you choose to do so yourself. Don't even think about using this thing unless it's for lighting up a campfire. Here's an example of a chess Archfiend build in case any of you were morbidly curious enough to want to build one for yourselves. And that should do it for the chess Archfiends, but we still have 3 more sets to go through. The next series we'll be looking at is the fringe sub-archetype from 5Ds, that being Red Dragon Archfiends. Used by everyone's favorite character from 5Ds, Jack Assless, it represents a break from the established norms of the archetype both in design and mechanics. For one thing, they're mostly dragons, but additionally they also lack the typical bone and sinew aesthetic that previous members of the archetype had. Some of the previous cards discussed in the mass review could be argued as being part of the series, mainly by virtue of being used by Jack, but since there's no real effect theming among them, I decided to ignore them. I also won't be covering resonators for the same reason, as they have no real synergy with this archetype aside from simply being tuners, and the same also applies to most of the red monsters that were designed as indirect support for these cards, albeit with one exception. However, before we get into that, it's worth taking a look at the monster that this entire series is based around, the original Red Dragon Archfiend. It's a level 8 Dark Dragon Synchro with 3000 attack and 2000 defense. It's completely generic, and after damage calculation, if this card attacks a defense position monster, destroy all defense position monsters your opponent controls. During your end phase, destroy all other monsters you control that did not declare an attack this turn. This card must be on the field in order to activate and resolve this effect. Let's face it, by now the original RDA is basically hot garbage. It's got a really good attack spread for a generic level 8 synchro, and a number of support cards directly involve this specific card. But for the former argument, I would point to Borreload Savage Dragon, and for the latter, I would point to a certain retrain of this card which is not only objectively better, but straight up replaces this card by treating its name as the original once it's out of the extra deck. Not only is the nuke effect horribly outdated due to monsters rarely being put sideways anymore, but it also punishes you for losing by nuking your own board unless you attack with everything, setting aside the fact that if you need to play defense, you would lose your monsters anyway by crashing them into your opponent's board. The best thing I can say about it is that it kicks off the theme of RDA's nuking the opponent's board and aggressively attacking everything in sight, but it does so in the least ceremonious way possible and is not nearly worth all the spectacle. Don't bother with this one unless you happen to be a huge sucker for nostalgia, which admittedly I know some of you are. There are only 2 monsters in the main deck which actually fall under support for this sub-archetype, the first of which being the exception to the rule I mentioned at the start of this section, Red Gardna. It's a level 4 Fire Fiend with 0 attack and 2000 defense, and when your opponent activates a card or effect while you control an RDA monster, as a quick effect, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard to prevent your monsters from being destroyed by your opponent's card effects this turn. I'm gonna go ahead and say that RDAs did not need a card like this one if they needed to be relevant. Sure, protection is nice in general, and having it on a hand trap is really helpful, but the fact that it's limited to destruction leaves a lot to be desired from a modern gameplay standard. If it protected from your own effects as well, this could have been seen as a way to prevent the original from sucking quite so much, even though it would still require the opponent to trigger it by activating a card effect during your turn. However, this is not the case, and even if it were, it still wouldn't be enough to make me consider running the original in this day and age. At best, it's a decent side deck card for certain matchups if you're confident in your deck's RDA spam ability, but outside of that, I wouldn't bother. The other main deck monster is the quote-unquote assault mode version of the original, which in case you were unaware was a gimmick from the late 5Ds era where you could use an underwhelming normal trap card to put assault on your hard to summon synchro monster in order to bring out a so-called upgraded form from the main deck. Red Dragon Archfiend Assault Mode, as one might expect of the lineup, is a level 10 Dark Dragon with 500 more attack and defense than the original, has the standard Assault Mode effects of only being able to be summoned with Assault Mode Activate using Red Dragon Archfiend, and floats back into the original when it's destroyed on the field. After damage calculation, if this card attacks, destroy all other monsters. All other monsters where? The entire world? Obviously it's talking about the field, but there's one way to rule shark someone, to just make them destroy all the monsters in their deck because the card doesn't specify otherwise. Regardless, this card is a bit too explosive for its own good. On the one hand, it makes for good field clearing, but on the other, it only works through battle, is easily disruptible, and worst of all, it affects your field as well, giving your opponent the first chance to recover. It's far from the worst assault mode monster, but it's definitely not something you'd want to run outside of a dedicated assault mode build. I would call this the RDA's Pot G if it weren't for the fact that there's an even bigger one yet to come. At any rate, don't run this. Moving back to the synchros, we next have the manga version of RDA, that being Hot Red Dragon Archfiend. I get that someone on the design team must have had a raging hard-on for this thing. Same type stats, attribute, and summoning condition as the original, and once per turn during your main phase 1, you can destroy all other attack position monsters on the field. Monsters other than this card cannot attack the turn you activate this effect. Now that's much better. Nuke the field for free and continue to make plays completely uninterrupted by monsters at the cost of only being able to attack with Hot Red, which is perfectly fine with a 3000 beater that's almost surely going to be attacking directly by this point. The effect is also a soft once per turn as well, so you can clear out any floaters your opponent has well, but doing so prevents you from attacking at all since it counts individual instances of this card as being other monsters. It also affects your field as well, but it can easily be played around, especially with the new rule revisions, and you're not likely to have much to blow up after investing in the level 8 synchro anyway. Hell, there are even a few Archfiends that want to be blown up, so you could easily use this effect as a trigger in order to get their own effects off. The worst thing I can say about it is that it doesn't treat its name as the original RDA, which leaves a lot of the archetype support dead on arrival since they require specifically the original, as I mentioned earlier. But it's still a very handy nuke effect to have, so running one certainly couldn't hurt. Next up, we have the Arc 5 retrain of the original, Scarlight Red Dragon Archfiend. Again, same everything as the original, only with 500 more defense, and its name becomes Red Dragon Archfiend while it's on the field or in the graveyard. Once per turn, you can destroy as many special summoned effect monsters on the field as possible with attack less than or equal to this card's other than this card itself. Then inflict 500 damage to your opponent for each monster destroyed. Yeah, you thought Hot Red has an easy and useful nuke effect? Get a load of this bad boy. Yes, the conditions for this one are a lot more specific, but in a typical end board, monsters with more than 3000 attack are rare, normal summon monsters are even rarer, and non-effect monsters are virtually non-existent. So there's a good chance that this card will still be able to wipe the opponent's entire field. It does once again affect your field as well, but beyond hoping to trigger your own floating effects, it also gives some utility to those destroyed monsters by dealing some sweet Abaki burn, so it's not a total loss either. It also has no restrictions on the effect whatsoever, so you're free to continue making plays completely uninterrupted. More importantly, it also treats itself as the original, which is important since, again, a lot of the support requires it, and you aren't going to want to run the original RDA anyway. Be sure to run this if you plan on doing anything with RDAs. The next monster is the first evolution of the manga version, that being Hot Red Dragon Archfiend Abyss. It's a level 9 with 3200 attack and 2500 defense, requires 1 tuner and 1 non-tuner Dark Dragon Synchro as material, and as a quick effect, you can target one face-up card your opponent controls and negate its effects until the end of the turn. When this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent, you can target one tuner in your graveyard and special summon it in defense position. You can only use each effect of Hot Red Dragon Archfiend Abyss once per turn. I'm afraid you're gonna have to deal with some minor PTSD on my end with this one. Needless to say, we've reached the second pot G of the Archfiends. The free and easy spot negation was a fantastically unique thing to have back in the day, and it still is given the plethora of generic negate and pop effects out there at the moment. And that extra 200 attack means that it could run over just about anything the opponent could put out, especially after the negation. This was meant to be balanced by the card's summoning conditions, which had it more or less locked into its own archetype. However, since it didn't have any other restrictions on being summoned, it could be cheated out of the extra deck very easily. And since it just so happened to be a dragon, it ended up seeing tons of play back in the days of Guard Dragon Control as one of their negation options alongside Crystal Wing and Vortex Dragon. Ever since Agarpain hit the ban list, this hasn't seen much play since, but if it ever does come off, be prepared to see a whole lot more of this again. The tuner summoning effect is a thing, but it may as well not be since the deck this thing is played in have already won the game by the time this thing is on board, and they rarely have tuners in their graveyard to begin with anyway. It's still one of RDA's best monsters, and it's not too terribly difficult to summon, but it's never going to be able to pull its weight more than it does in generic controller decks that can cheat him out of the deck fairly regularly. The next monster is the first evolution of the original anime version, Majestic Red Dragon. It's a level 10 with 4000 attack and 3000 defense, requires Majestic Dragon, Red Dragon Archfiend, and one non-tuner monster as material, and it cannot be destroyed by card effects. After damage calculation, if this card attacks, destroy all defense position monsters on the field. Once per turn, you can target one face-up monster your opponent controls, negate its effects, and if you do, this card gains that monster's attack until the end phase. During the end phase, target one Red Dragon Archfiend in your graveyard, return this card to the extra deck, then special summon that target. At a certain point, you have to ignore how good a card is in favor of determining whether it's even worth the effort. In this case, not even close. You have to have not only a very specific level 8 Synchro monster, but also a specific tuner monster, that being Majestic Dragon, which is a little pink dildo who cannot be used as Synchro material except for the Synchro summon of a Majestic monster. Does it offer any sort of benefits to alleviate this restriction? None whatsoever. In addition to this, you also need to have a level 1 non-tuner on the field, at which point if the card in question doesn't straight up win you the game, it will only be a monumental waste of effort that could have been spent making plays that actually would have benefited your position. The protection is okay, the spot negation and attack boost are nice, and the nuke effect is borderline irrelevant now. But for the colossal amount of effort needed to summon this thing, it's not nearly worth the effort. To add to this lanky son of a bitch has the audacity to fuck off back to the extra deck at the end of the turn, so you can't even set up any field presence with this card, unless you invest even further resources to get rid of the RDA in your graveyard to prevent the self-bouncing effect from going off. In a vacuum, it's a decent card, but for the amount of effort needed to bring it out and maintain it on the field, decent just isn't going to cut it. Next up is the second manga evolution, Hot Red Dragon Archfiend Bane.
Oh, you think darkness is your ally? You merely adopted the dark. I was born in it.
It's a level 10 with 3500 attack and 3000 defense, same summoning conditions as Abyss, and you can tribute one monster, then target one Red Dragon Archfiend monster in your graveyard and special summon it. When this card inflicts battle damage, you can special summon 2 tuners with the same level and defense position, one from your deck and one from your graveyard. You can only use each effect of Hot Red Dragon Archfiend Bane once per turn. This one kind of confuses me. After Abyss, which was clearly a solid monster on its own, we get a non-generic level 10 synchro play extender? Don't get me wrong, it's a pretty good play extender, especially if you manage to summon him off of Abyss, which you can easily revive with this card's effect. And while the condition for the tuner summoning effect is a tad annoying, if you manage to pull it off, it opens the way for the real big dick synchros in the lineup. He does a great job with what he does, I just wish he did literally anything else. Nothing about this effect says to me that this is meant to be an evolution of the RDA lineup, since he doesn't do anything that the archetype has set itself up to do. Still, he's perfectly serviceable for what he does, so feel free to run 1 or 2. The next monster is the Soul Evolution from Arc 5, that being Tyrant Red Dragon Archfiend. It's another level 10 with the same stats as Bane, it's completely generic aside from requiring 2 tuners, and it must be synchro summoned. You can only use each of the following effects of Tyrant Red Dragon Archfiend once per turn. During your main phase 1, you can destroy all other cards on the field, but other monsters you control cannot attack this turn. And during the battle phase, when a spell or trap is activated, you can negate the activation, and if you do, destroy it, and if you do that, this card gains 500 attack. It's really weird how this feels like more of an evolution of Hot Red than anything else that the manga put forward. The first effect is just a better effect of Hot Red's nuke effect, right down to having the exact same restrictions. And the second effect is just battle trap protection, which was a bit outdated when the card first came out and is basically irrelevant now. The most curious thing about it is the double tuner requirement, which is a feature that RDAs had by this point adopted as their own gimmick, since of the 5 monsters that require double tuning, 3 of them are Red Dragon Archfiend monsters. This can make them a bit tricky to summon without consistent tuner spamming, but the materials are still generic enough to not be too unreasonable. This one in particular is the easiest of the big dick synchros to make due to it being level 10 and not requiring any specific non-tuners. So while it may not win any games on its own, an easily accessible board nuke is a very thing to have around. Run 1. The next monster is the final evolution of the anime, Red Nova Dragon. It's a level 12 with the same stats as the last 2, requires 2 tuners and specifically Red Dragon Archfiends as material, and it gains 500 attack for each tuner in your graveyard. Cannot be destroyed by your opponent's card effects. When an opponent's monster declares an attack, you can target the attacking monster, banish this card, and if you do, negate the attack. During the next end phase, special summon this card banished by this effect. It's everything that was good about Majestic Red Dragon without all the obnoxious downsides. When this card hits the field, it's guaranteed to have at least 4,500 attack, though usually even more by this point, so the main quality of this thing is to be able to hit like a truck. The effect protection that was fantastic back in the day has since been power crept into just fine territory, and the attack negation was never the most relevant part of the card since nobody in their right mind would be attacking while staring down the barrel of a 6k beater in the first place. It's not the easiest thing to bring to the table due to the double tuning and requiring a specific level 8 synchros material, making it an inherent -3 in card advantage. But for the flat damage output you're able to pull off with this card, it's worth a spot in the extra deck just for the sake of the big beater option. The next monster is the final manga evolution, Hot Red Dragon Archfiend King Calamity. These names are getting more incomprehensible by the second. Another level 12 with 4,000 attack and 3,500 defense, requires 2 tuners and a non-tuner Dark Dragon Synchro as material, and when this card is synchro summoned you can activate this effect. For the rest of this turn, your opponent cannot activate cards, and cards they control cannot activate their effects. Your opponent cannot activate cards or effects in response to this effect's activation. If this card destroys a monster by battle, inflict damage to your opponent equal to that monster's original attack. If this card in its owner's possession is destroyed by an opponent's card, you can target one level 8 or lower Dark Dragon Synchro monster in your graveyard and special summon it. Sure, it's a better final boss than Red Nova, but we've got an even better one to get to after this. It hits pretty hard, completely disabling the opponent on summon while it does so, which can be nasty if they don't stop the card from being summoned in the first place. The floating effect can come in handy as a last resort comeback tool, although I wish it had the option to revive Bane or Abyss for the sake of making said comeback a bit easier. Speaking of Bane, the fact that he can set up summoning this card entirely on his own makes it among the easier of the big dick synchros, brought down only by the fact that you would have to have used up the battle phase by this point and missed the optimal window for summoning this. If there was an easier way to synchro summon on the opponent's turn, this would be monumentally better, especially since dropping this bad boy as a play interruption would be absolutely hysterical. It certainly looks and feels like a final evolution of RDAs, but most of the potential for this card is currently being squandered. Perhaps they should get advice from a certain other red dragon. Anyway, run one of these. The last monster is a brand new one which has yet to appear anywhere outside of the OCG, Red Supernova Dragon. It's yet another level 12 with 4,000 attack and 3,000 defense, requires 3 tuners and 1 or more non-tuner synchro monsters as material, and it must first be synchro summoned, gains 500 attack for each tuner in your graveyard and cannot be destroyed by your opponent's card effects. Once per turn where your opponent activates a monster effect, or when an opponent's monster declares an attack, quick effect, you can banish this card and all cards your opponent controls. During your next end phase after this card was banished by its own effect, special summon this banished card. It basically combines and improves on the effects of Red Nova and Tyrant RDA. I'm assuming it doesn't also have King Calamity's lockout effect, mainly because they ran out of space to write on the card. By default, it will hit the field with at least 500 attack over the baseline cap of all monsters, meaning it can run over pretty much anything that can be killed by battle just out of the box. Any other setup, however, and this thing can easily get to the point of OTKing the opponent entirely on its own. Furthermore, it has a quick effect board wipe that not only disrupts the opponent's plays, but also banishes the opponent's entire board without targeting or destroying, back row included, so they can't even get any floating effects off. Fittingly, it's also the hardest one to summon, requiring 3 tuners and at least 1 synchro monster as material, which makes it an inherent -4 at least. But thankfully, it has the ability to win the game on its own, so the tremendous amount of effort needed to summon it is worth it in the end. Run 1. Their first spell card is Red Dragon Vase. It's a normal spell which lets you draw 2 cards if you control the original Red Dragon Archfiend, but you cannot normal or special summon the turn you activate this card, and until the end of your opponent's turn after this card is activated. This feels like halfway through designing the card they forgot what game they were making it for. Drawing 2 on a normal spell is inherently a great effect, but preventing all summons for this turn and the next turn in order to do so severely overbalances it. Since this deck relies very heavily on summoning, most cards in the main deck will be devoted to spamming monsters, which means that, more often than not, the cards you draw with this effect will now be dead on arrival with the summoning restrictions. Simply controlling the original RDA would have sufficed as a restriction since it still landlocks the card into its intended archetype. But since this card effectively counters the archetype it was made for, not even drawing 5 would have been worth the effort. Don't run this. The next card is Scarlet Security, another normal spell which lets you destroy all spell traps the opponent controls if you control the original RDA. It's fine. An archetypal Harpy's Feather Duster is pretty good to have, but requiring the original RDA in order to use it does limit it a bit, since you might not be able to get it out if your opponent has a lot of back row you need to deal with, since they would most likely be floodgates in that situation. Hell, even if they're not, they're definitely going to have some negation in there somewhere, or at least some way to protect their back row, so even if you can pull it off, it's still not likely to solve any of your problems aside from possibly baiting out a negate. Still, it could be seen as a cheaper version of Lightning Storm, so feel free to run it if you like. Their first trap card is Red Cocoon, a normal trap that targets and equips itself to a dragon-type synchro you control. While it battles an opponent's monster, negate the effects of all monsters your opponent controls until the end of the damage step. During the end phase, if this card's in the graveyard because it was sent there this turn, you can target 1 Red Dragon Archfiend in your graveyard and special summon it. I'm struggling to come up with a point for this card to exist. The floating effect is nice and it doesn't care how it was sent to the graveyard for it to go off, but the fact that it's limited to the original RDA severely limits what it can do. The fact that it only works during the end phase also makes for a huge pain, since if you summon the original RDA, it's then going to immediately nuke your own board if you didn't attack with absolutely everything earlier that turn. Granted, nobody is going to be using the original since Scarlight exists, but my point still stands. Also, the effect negation is great in theory, especially since it affects all your opponent's monsters, but the fact that it only works for the singular battle that the equipped monster takes place in means that it won't actually be doing anything. Seriously, the only thing I can think of that this would be useful for is against monsters like Gren Maju who use effects to boost their attack to stupid levels, or cards like Construct who auto-kill certain monsters without applying damage calc. Even then, cards like that are better taken care of before the battle phase even begins, so there's almost nothing for this card to do on the field. Maybe if the deck had some discarding effects, this might have been useful as a gimmicky fodder card to float into RDA during the end phase. But even if that were the case, going out of your way to make discard fodder has been an incredibly dumb idea ever since Sinister Serpent got banned. Bottom line is, don't run this. The next card is Red Rain, not to be confused with Purple Rain. Another normal trap with this effect. If you control a level 8 or higher synchro monster, banish all monsters on the field except the monsters with the highest level. Also, the remaining face-up monsters on the field are unaffected by other card effects except their own until the end of this turn. If a Dark Dragon synchro monster is synchro summoned to your field while this card is in the graveyard, you can add this card to your hand. You can only use this effect of Red Rain once per turn. This is basically the very definition of a win more card. I'm getting the strangest sense of deja vu here. Obviously, you're going to want to activate this while you control one of the level 12 so that you're guaranteed to have the highest level on the field unless you're going up against FAs or something. However, by that point, you already had at least one monster with at least 4k attack, some level of protection, and enough firepower to likely win the game on its own. So an additional board wipe on top of that seemed more than a bit excessive. I do like that it can recycle itself if you summon any RDA monster, but again, resolving this effect means that you've probably won the game 2 or 3 times over. Sure, it's cathartic to pull off, and you don't necessarily need to have the level 12s to use it. Hell, Abyss or Tyrant should still be more than enough in most cases. But it's also very much unnecessary, so I still wouldn't bother running it. The next card is the final normal trap in the series, Red Supremacy. Usually I would make a joke about what this would be called if it were a Blue Eye support card, but now of all times is definitely not the place for such humor. Banish one Red Dragon Archfiend Synchro monster from your graveyard, then target one Red Dragon Archfiend Synchro monster you control. Its name becomes the banished monster's original name and replace its effect with the banished monster's original effects. Again, I'm left wondering just what the point of this card is supposed to be. The idea is probably to banish the original or Scarlight so that you can use your other RDA monsters for bigger synchros, but aside from Hot Red, all of the other RDAs have a higher level than those two and are therefore harder to use as synchro material. Furthermore, the only ones that require specifically Red Dragon Archfiend as material are Majestic Red, which would be impossible to summon with a higher level monster, and Red Nova, which would also be difficult since it requires 2 tuners. The effect copy is permanent, so it could be used to give Abyss's negation effect to a smaller RDA if you needed to, but by that point you'd probably just want to have Abyss on the field instead to run stuff over easier. If it could turn any monster into Red Dragon Archfiend, that would be cool and would make using it a whole lot easier, but as it stands right now, it's a gimmicky one-off at best with some niche uses to use if you're in a pinch. The next card is the continuous trap King Scarlet. If a Red Dragon Archfiend monster you control battles during damage calculation, make that monster you control unable to be destroyed by that battle, and if you do, special summon this card as a trap monster, a level 1 Fire Fiend tuner with 0 attack and defense. Again, nice in theory, but in practice it leaves a lot to be desired. Having a trap monster be a level 1 tuner is really handy since it'll make summoning the bigger synchros a lot easier, but the fact that it's tied to a battle trap means that it's severely limited on what it can do. Worst of all, it's more than likely going to be summoned on the opponent's turn and they're going to have no problem running over this 0/0 piece of fluff. Especially if they have at least one monster with over 3k attack, which they definitely do since you would have had to use this to protect your RDA. Sure, you could trigger it yourself and waste the battle trap effect, but you'd still have to wait for your own battle phase, meaning that this would have to survive face down for 3 turns before you'd have a chance to use it. All in all, it's not nearly worth the effort. Their other continuous trap is red screen. Your opponent cannot declare attacks. During each of your end phase, you must pay 1,000 life points or this card is destroyed. You can target one level 1 tuner in your graveyard, destroy this card, and if you do, special summon that target. Red Dragon Archfiend must be on the field to activate and resolve this effect. Jesus Christ, I thought I'd missed a Chess Archfiend card until it finally mentioned RDA. Anyway, this is fine. The fact that it just blanket prevents the opponent from attacking at all without any restrictions or conditions means that it could be a big problem if your opponent doesn't deal with it immediately. The life point costs can actually help benefit generic Archfiends, particularly if they run Master King, and the ability to avoid said costs in other situations to replace it with a free level 1 tuner is exceptionally handy, as it gives you a bridge to some of the bigger synchros. The only thing that brings it down to a significant degree is it simply being a trap card, preventing you from getting the tuner right away and relying on the opponent not having an out for this. However, the attack prevention is good enough on its own to warrant running it anyway. And the last card in this set is the counter trap card Crimson Fire. When your opponent activates a spell trap that would inflict damage to you while you control Red Dragon Archfiend, your opponent takes twice the effect damage you would have taken instead. My god, this is an anime card if ever I saw one. Not only does it only work if you control the original RDA, but it only counters burn effects and only spell trap burn effects at that, so it's not even going to help you unless your opponent happens to be running Blazing Mirror Force. Speaking of which, this card only counters the burn damage, not the effect itself, meaning that if the card does anything more than inflicting burn damage, like say Blazing Mirror Force destroys your monsters, this card isn't going to negate it, meaning that you went -1 to do absolutely nothing. There's a reason why Damage Juggler was used so much to counter Wavering Eyes, and it wasn't because people were scared of the massive 500 burn that was coming their way. My point is, don't even run this thing even if your life depended on it. Here's a Red Dragon Archfiend deck taking advantage of as much generic synchro support as they can. Dawnwalker and Duskwalker in particular are a godsend for this archetype. Now I would like to be able to move on to the next section, but due to certain circumstances, I'm out of time for this particular episode. I know I've done obnoxiously long episodes in the past, but this one has the potential to put all the others to shame, and I simply don't have the time to work on that monstrosity anymore. I'll try to get part 2 out as soon as I can, definitely by the usual upload schedule at the latest, so keep your eyes peeled for the finale of the finale. Until then, stay safe out there, don't get run over, and I'll see you guys later.
Hey! Bottled man, bitch!